Welcome to the 8th lecture in Module 5, and in this lecture we'll talk about how the model view controller design pattern is implemented in Rails. We've seen how the controllers work, and now let's put it all together to see how this HTTP request is handled by controllers and a response is provided. So in Rails, the following classes support the model view controller design pattern. We've already talked about the model. It's supported by the active record class, and it performs this object relational mapping that's very important that we'll use. The view, they're actually bundled together in Rails in something called action pack, right? We've talked about this. Dynamic content is generated by templates that are embedded using ERB, which is embedded Ruby, supported by this action view class that we're going to talk about in the next module. And then finally, the controller class. This is the core, again, of how a web request is handled in Rails, right? So it consists of these actions that are executed on requests that either render a template or redirect to another application, as we've already discussed. And we've already discussed the fact that these actions are defined as public methods in the controller that are made available through these routes that you define. Let's take a look at how this works step by step in detail in a Rails application. So it all starts by the browser sending an HTTP request to the web server. And this happens when somebody clicks on a link, say, in your web application. So this is the first thing. Let's take as an example the request. I'm assuming that you're running your server locally and that you're doing a GET request for posts. So we've seen previously that this should return the index of all the posts. So the first step is this request is issued as an HTTP GET request to your web server. Your web server takes a look at that and it processes that request. It determines which route it belongs to, and then it dispatches that request to the appropriate server method. So that's the next step I show here. Step 2. The web server looks at the routes that are available, and because we have resources posts, it knows that this is linked up to the index method in your post controller. And so the dispatcher here, as a second step, issues this to the controller, and now the controller has to look for this index method to see if it can execute it. It finds it, and the controller then asks the model for all of the information needed to complete that request. In our case, what that means is it wants all of the posts so it can create an index of them. And so if you look inside your controller on step 3, there's the @post variable, and we're doing post.all, which is an active record call to get all of the posts and then assign it to that instance variable called @posts. The next step is the model layer collects this information and returns it to the controller. So that's shown here. There's an array that's returned, and that's assigned to @post, and now that's available. And remember, your controller, all of the variables that are defined in your controller are also available to the view. And so that's the next thing that the controller does. The controller gives this information to the view, requesting a particular format. And in our case, this is an HTML because we didn't specify anything on the end. It's assumed that we're working with HTML. And so it asks the view to generate some HTML that can be returned. I show here that this @post is available to the view, and then the view is going to render this information in a format that the controller can ingest. And that's what I show here. This index.html.erb is used to generate the specific HTML that's going to go along with this request. So that's going to depend on the particular posts that are returned. The controller takes this and includes it with some other HTML. The total amount of HTML that's compiled depends upon the application.html file, as well as this index.html.erb file that was executed in order to dynamically create content that's going to be returned. And so that's what I show here. The controller assembles all of that, packages it together, and gives it to the web server. The web server then, finally, returns that page to the browser, and you see the listing of posts on your browser. And that's the last step in this process. This text response, which is HTML, is given to the browser, and you see the list of posts on your web page. So this is how the model view controller is implemented on Rails. These are the interactions that take place, and it's very important to understand every step of this when you're building a Rails application. This completes the 8th and final lecture in Module 5.